He came to the auction looking for a horse. He left with 5 children instead. When Caleb saw those kids standing on that platform, holding hands in a human chain about to be sold off separately like cattle, he made a decision that would cost him everything. $60. Every penny he had saved for 2 years, gone in an instant for 5 orphans he had never met. But buying them was just the beginning of his troubles. A wealthy family wanted the oldest boy. They had money, power, and friends in high places. They told Caleb he was condemning these children to poverty, that a single man had no business raising 5 kids alone, that they would take that boy, whether Caleb liked it or not. What happened next would be talked about across the entire territory for years to come. This is the story of a promise that refused to break, and the moment a 12-year-old boy stood before a courtroom and said words that silenced everyone. The value. This story proves that family is not about blood or money. It's about showing up and refusing to let go. Sometimes the craziest decision you ever make turns out to be the only one that matters. If you believe that keeping promises still means something, drop a comment below. Hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that fighting for family is always worth it. That November wind whipped the smell of dirt and desperation across the stockyards. Caleb had come for a strong draft horse, something to break the rocky soil on his ranch. He had not come for this. He was listening to the auctioneer, a man named Holloway, who could turn a man's own greed against him with just a few fast words. "Sold that bay mare for $22, Holloway hollered, his hammer cracking down. "Next lot, folks, and this one is special." The crowd shifted, their boots scuffing the dirt. Caleb stood up taller, thinking the draft horses were next. Instead, he saw 5 kids climbing onto the auction block. The oldest was a boy, maybe 12 years old, with a face that had learned to show nothing at all. He held a little girl's hand, who held a younger boy's hand, who held another girl's hand, who was holding a tiny child on her hip. They were a human chain, and Caleb saw the oldest boy's knuckles were bone white from holding on so tight. "Now, I know what you are all thinking," Holloway said, his voice turning syrupy sweet. "But these are not orphans needing charity. These are able-bodied workers looking for a home." He pointed his hammer at the boy. "That one is strong as an ox." He then pointed to the older girl. "She can cook and mend better than most women." A man in a clean suit and a bowler hat stood nearby, looking at the crowd like he was selling furniture, not children. "Placement," Caleb whispered, and the word tasted like ash in his mouth. "And here's the best part," Holloway beamed. "You do not have to take all 5. It is a split lot. Need a farmhand? Take the boy. Need help in the kitchen? Take one of the girls." The crowd started murmuring. A few men took a step closer, interested. The oldest boy, Nate, stood completely still. His eyes scanned the faces in the crowd, one by one. When his eyes met Caleb's, there was no question in them, no hope. Just a tired look that said he had been through this before. Another town, another auction, another day of being treated like property. The man in the bowler hat spoke up then. "These children lost their folks to fever last spring. The church cannot afford to feed them through the winter. They need homes, and you all need workers. It is a practical solution." Someone in the crowd, a woman, asked, "What about keeping them together?" The man just smiled a cold smile. "Ma'am, that is a nice thought, but it is not practical. They understand they will be separated." Caleb watched the smallest girl bury her face in her sister's dress. "Let's start the bidding at $15 for the boy," Holloway announced. "A good, strong worker." $15, the same price as the horse they just sold. Men in the crowd sized Nate up, checking his shoulders and his height, calculating how much work they could get out of him. The boy stood like a statue, but Caleb could see the fast rise and fall of his chest. The 10-year-old girl was crying now, but she made no sound. Her tears just streamed down her face as she stared straight ahead. The little boy beside her had his eyes squeezed shut. The chain of hands pulled tighter. $18 from the gentleman at the Double Bar Ranch, Holloway called out. Caleb thought about his own ranch. A small cabin with a leaky roof and land so stubborn it barely grew enough to feed his horses. He had $60 to his name, saved up over 2 long years. He needed that money for a draft horse, so he could finally make something of the place his father had lost. He thought about going home to that quiet cabin, to the empty chairs and the lonely silence. Then he looked at those 5 children, about to be scattered like seeds in the wind, never to be a family again. $18, going once, Holloway started. All of them, Caleb's voice cut through the air. The whole stockyard went quiet. Everyone turned to look at him. I am sorry, Holloway said, blinking. Caleb walked right through the crowd. I said all of them. I will take all 5. The man in the bowler hat gave him a smile that did not reach his eyes. Sir, that is very noble, but the total price for 5... How much? Caleb asked flatly. Well, the boy is already at $18, and the girls would be valued at... I have got $60, Caleb said, pulling the worn bills from his pocket and holding them up for everyone to see. $60 for all 5 of them, right now. The bowler hat man's fake smile vanished. Sir, $60 is hardly... It is $60 more than you will get if I walk away from here, Caleb cut him off, his voice low and steady. And I tell every soul in this town how you sell children like cattle. The silence was heavy. You call it whatever you want to help you sleep at night, Caleb said, staring the man down. $60 all 5 together. Or I make a scene so loud the law will come asking questions you cannot answer. Caleb Harlow was the lawman in Prospect Junction, and he wasn't sure if selling children was against the law, but he knew it was dead wrong. He stared hard at the man in the bowler hat, his voice low and steady. He could see the gears turning in the man's head, weighing money against trouble. The man finally gave in. $60, he said. But you signed the papers. Legal placement. You're responsible for them. Every last thing. 10 minutes later, Caleb was in a dusty office signing papers he barely glanced at. The man, a Mr. Greet Burt Brush Fletcher, called himself a placement coordinator. He pointed and explained, using words like guardianship and liability. Caleb just kept signing, his hand aching. Through the dirty window, he saw the 5 children still on that platform, still holding hands. No one had even told them they could move. You know you're taking on 5 dependents, Fletcher said, his tone all business now that the money was paid. That is a heavy load for one man. Caleb looked up. I have a ranch, a roof, and food. Do you have any experience caring about them? Fletcher's face turned to stone. I place over 100 children a year in good homes. You were about to break them apart, Caleb cut in. Do not lecture me on what you do for them. He grabbed the stack of papers, folded them, and stuffed them in his coat. Are we finished here? Fletcher's voice was cold as ice. Yes. But understand this, Mr. Harlow. I will be checking on those children. If I find they are being mistreated or used for nothing but labor, I will have them taken away from you. Good, Caleb said, meeting his gaze. You do that. You come and check. And while you are at it, maybe you should check on all those other children you placed. Make sure those good homes are as good as you believe. He walked out before Fletcher could say another word. The sun was getting low, painting the sky orange and red. The auction crowd was gone. The only ones left were those 5 children on the platform. A sick feeling hit Caleb when he realized they were still standing there because no one had given them permission to leave. They had been taught to wait, to be nothing more than obedient property. He walked across the dusty yard, his boots crunching in the dirt. When he got to the platform, 5 pairs of eyes locked on him. The oldest boy, Nate, stepped slightly in front of the others, a small human shield. Up close, Caleb saw what the sales pitch had left out. The worn-out coats, the shoes tied together with string, and an emptiness in their faces that came from more than just hunger. My name is Caleb Harlow, he said softly. I have a ranch about 20 miles from here. It is not much. 3 rooms and a drafty window, but the stove works and there is food for the winter. There is room for all of you. Nate's wary expression never changed. For how long? That question hit Caleb square in the chest. How long, as if this was just another stop before they were sold off again, one by one. For as long as you need, Caleb said. I am not splitting you up. I am not selling you. You are all coming to my ranch, and you are all staying together. That is the deal. That is my promise. Nate looked at him with eyes that had seen too many promises broken. You do not even know us. No, Caleb admitted. But I know what I saw up there. I saw what that man was about to do. And I know I have room for 5 children who need to stick together. Caleb held out his hand. So, what do you say? Are you ready to get down from this platform and come home with me? The silence felt heavy. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow. Then, very slowly, Nate reached out and took Caleb's hand. His own hand was small, rough, and cold as ice. Caleb helped him down, then turned to the others. The 10-year-old girl, Elsie, came next, her hand shaking. Then came Ben, who was 8, his eyes squeezed shut. Then came 6-year-old Ruth, who would not let go of the youngest, May, as Caleb lifted them both down. Little May, who was barely 4 years old, just stared at Caleb with wide, dark eyes, saying nothing. They all stood together at the bottom of the platform. 5 children and 1 rancher who had just spent every dollar he had on a promise he wasn't sure how to keep. He looked at them and felt the true weight of his decision settle on his shoulders. You all have names, he asked gently. Nate nodded. I am Nate. This is Elsie, Ben, Ruth, and May, he said, pointing to each one. We were the Carver kids. I guess we are whatever you want to call us now. You are still the Carver kids, Caleb said with firmness. You keep your name. You keep your family. That does not change. He looked at the setting sun. But we need to get moving. It is a 3-hour ride, and I would rather not do it in the dark. Have any of you ever ridden a horse? 5 little heads shook no. Of course not. Caleb's old wagon was hitched nearby, pulled by a mare named Rosie. He lifted the children into the back, using empty feed sacks to make a small cushion on the wooden boards. They settled down without a single complaint, huddled together just like they were on the platform, with Nate watching over the others. Caleb climbed onto the driver's seat and clicked his tongue. Rosie pulled and the wagon lurched forward. He heard a tiny gasp from the back as the movement startled May. They rolled out of Prospect Junction just as the sun disappeared. Caleb did not look back at that stockyard, at that platform where 5 children had been waiting to be scattered to the wind. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, toward home. For the first hour, nobody said a word. Caleb just drove, listening to the quiet sounds of the children behind him, a soft murmur now and then from Nate. They were siblings who had learned to speak in whispers. When the road smoothed out and the sky was completely dark, Elsie's small voice carried to him. Mr. Harlow? Just Caleb, he said. A moment passed. Caleb, why did you take all of us? It was the question he was expecting, the one he wasn't sure how to answer. Why did he do it? A smart man would have kept walking. A practical man would have bought a horse, not a family. But Caleb hadn't been feeling very practical since he saw them all holding hands. You ever see something that you just cannot unsee? He asked her quietly. Something that sticks in your mind and refuses to leave? Yes, Nate answered from the back. Lots of times. That is what happened to me today, Caleb said. I saw the 5 of you up there, and I knew what was about to happen. I knew I could not walk away and live with myself. My father always said a man's worth is measured by the promises he keeps. And standing in that stockyard, he had made a promise to himself. I made a promise to myself right then and there. If I could put a stop to this, I would. So that is exactly what I did. You do not even know us, Nate said again. But his voice had a different ring to it this time. Not so much tough, but more lost. Maybe that makes it easier, I told him. Since I do not know you, I do not know all the reasons I probably should not be doing this. All I see is your family, and a family has no business being split apart just because some fella behind a desk says so." From the back of the wagon, Ben's little voice piped up. "Are you going to split us up later on?" That question hit Caleb square in the chest. "No." "How can we know for sure?" Ruth asked, her voice steady. "How do we know you will not just change your mind when things get tough?" Caleb pulled back on Rosie's reins, and the old wagon groaned to a halt. He turned around to face the 5 children huddled together. 5 sets of eyes stared back, reflecting the big Texas sky. "I do not know what y'all have been through," he said, his voice low and even. "I do not know what happened after your folks passed, but I know this much. 3 years ago, I bought this ranch when everyone said it was nothing but dust. I spent 3 years breaking my back on this land to make something from nothing. You know why? Because when I decide something is worth the effort, I do not quit." Caleb looked straight at Nate. "Today, I decided you 5 are worth the effort. So no matter how hard it gets, I am not quitting. I am not walking away. And I am sure as heck not splitting you up. That is a promise. And I keep my promises." Little May started to cry. Quiet sobs she tried to hide in her sister's coat. Ruth just held her close, rocking her gently. Ben just stared, caught somewhere between hoping and being terrified to believe. Nate's jaw was set tight, but his eyes were shining in the starlight. He gave one sharp nod, then looked away. Caleb turned back and clucked to Rosie, and the wagon started rolling again into the dark. They got to the ranch about 2 hours after sundown. The little cabin was nestled in a valley, a dark shape under a sky full of stars. Caleb had left a lantern burning in the window. It was a habit he had from years of coming home to an empty house. Tonight, though, for the very first time, someone was actually waiting for him. He pulled the wagon up to the porch and set the brake. His legs felt stiff from the long, cold ride. He heard the kids moving behind him, slow and unsure. "Come on," Caleb said, reaching up to help May down. He helped them down one by one from the wagon. 5 worn-out children who looked like they could barely stand. The cabin door was stuck, same as always. When it finally popped open, warm air that smelled of wood smoke and old coffee drifted out. He had left the stove burning low. It was a small comfort, but he would take it. "Inside," he told them, holding the door open. They shuffled in, staying close together. Caleb shut the door on the cold November night. The main room was small, with just a table and chairs, a wood stove, and a narrow bed in the corner where Caleb slept. 2 other doors led to small bedrooms. 5 kids, 3 rooms, and not a single plan in his head. Caleb lit a couple more lanterns and the cabin filled with a warm, flickering light. The children just stood in the middle of the floor, looking like they were scared to touch anything. "Are you all hungry?" Caleb asked. Nate started to shake his head no, but then stopped himself. "Yes," he said quietly. "Just call me Caleb. The other name makes me feel old." He went to the stove and added a couple logs to the fire. "I have got beans and salt pork and some cornbread from yesterday. It is not much, but it will fill you up." He moved with a practiced ease, a man used to cooking for himself. He sliced the cornbread thick and set a pot of beans on the stove. While the food was heating, he looked over at the children. They had not moved an inch. They were just standing there waiting for someone to tell them what to do. "Let's get one thing straight," Caleb said, his voice steady and calm. "This is your home now. That means you sit when you are tired. You get warm when you are cold. You ask for what you need. You do not need permission just to be. Do you understand?" They all gave slow nods, but nobody moved a muscle. Caleb let out a soft sigh. "Elsie, honey, grab those chairs and pull them over to the stove. Everybody, sit down and get the chill off while this food heats up." That finally got them on their feet. Elsie and Ben wrestled the chairs over by the wood stove's welcome heat. They settled in carefully, leaving one chair empty for him out of habit. He just sat on the floor, leaning back against the wall. "Tell me about yourselves," he prompted. "The Carver kids. Where y'all from?" Nate finally spoke, his voice low. "We had a little place about 40 miles south. Pa worked it with Ma. Grew corn, had some chickens. He trailed off. It was good. What happened? Caleb asked gently. Fever came through last spring, Nate said, his hands tightening on his knees. Pa went first, died in 3 days. Ma fought it for a week. He swallowed hard. After she passed, her brother, Uncle Thomas, came. He said he was taking us to his place in Denver. But he never did, Caleb guessed. No. He took us to an orphanage, said he would be back for us. That was 6 months ago. The place was packed, Nate went on. They put me and Ben in one building and the girls in another. We only saw them at meals. Then they started sending kids off to families. They took May first. Ruth let out a tiny, pained whimper, and Elsie put an arm around her. I slipped out, Nate said. Found the farm where she was, about 10 miles off. The woman there already had 6 of her own. May just cried all the time. He paused. So I took her, and we ran. Found the others, and we hid in a barn for 2 nights before they caught us. And put you somewhere else, Caleb finished. Nate just nodded. 3 more places after that. They always promised to keep us together, but it never lasted. Then Mr. Fletcher got involved. Said finding us one home was not practical. The beans started to bubble, filling the little cabin with a wonderful smell. Caleb got up and began dishing out big portions into bowls. He made sure they were full. Here, he said, handing each a bowl and a thick slice of cornbread. Eat up. We will figure everything else out later. They ate with a slow, careful gratitude that broke his heart. Not a single crumb was wasted. May dozed off, her head falling against Ruth's shoulder. Ruth just shifted to hold her and kept eating with one hand. Nobody complained, and nobody asked for more, even though Caleb knew they were still hungry. He just refilled their bowls without a word. When they were done, Caleb looked at the 5 exhausted children. All right, he said. The back room has my parents' old bed. Girls, that is yours tonight. Nate, Ben, you 2 can take my bed in the corner. I will sleep on the floor. We can take the floor, Nate said right away. You do not have to do that. We are not arguing about it. You are kids, you get beds. I'm a grown man with a bedroll. I will be fine, Caleb said, stretching his back. Tonight, everybody just needs to sleep. Nate looked like he wanted to argue, but he was too tired. Fair. It took a few minutes to get everyone settled. The girls vanished into the back room. Ben was asleep the second his head touched the pillow. Nate lingered, looking like a cornered animal. You can rest now, Caleb said softly. The door is locked and the stove is warm. Nothing will happen to you or your sisters. The tension finally left Nate's shoulders. He climbed into bed, and in moments his breathing was deep and even. Caleb banked the fire in the stove and laid his own bedroll on the floor. The little cabin creaked around him, making the sounds of a home again, not just an empty house. From the other room, he heard Ruth humming a soft lullaby. 5 children, $60, and 1 promise. Caleb stared up into the dark and wondered what in the world he had done. Outside, the winter wind howled. Somewhere in town, Mr. Fletcher was likely proud of another job well done. But in this little cabin, 20 miles from nowhere, 5 siblings were together under one roof. For tonight, they were safe. For tonight, they were home. Caleb would worry about tomorrow when it came. For now, he had given these kids the one thing they had lost, each other. He closed his eyes, believing that sometimes the craziest choice is the only one that makes any sense. Dawn broke cold and quiet. Caleb woke up feeling the weight of 5 other souls breathing in the silent cabin. He was used to waking up alone. This was a different kind of quiet. He rose from his bedroll, his joints aching from the hard floor. He fed some wood to the dying coals in the stove and watched the flames come back to life. He looked around the room with new eyes. Nate and Ben were still sound asleep in the corner. The door to the back room was shut tight. They were all still here. His impulsive decision from yesterday now felt very real in the morning light. He moved quietly, putting coffee on to boil and pulling out the last of the bacon. He had enough supplies for 1 man to last the winter. For 6 people, it would be gone in 6 weeks. It was just another problem to add to his list. The smell of frying bacon woke Nate first. The boy's eyes opened and Caleb saw him take in his surroundings. He checked on his brother, scanned the room for threats, and then his eyes landed on Caleb. A little bit of the tension in his shoulders seemed to melt away. "Morning," Caleb said softly. "Sleep okay?" Nate sat up. "Yes, sir. Yes. Best I have slept in a long time." "Good," Caleb said, turning the bacon. "You want to give me a hand waking the others? It might be better coming from you." Nate nodded, then padded across the cold floor. He gave Ben a gentle shake, then went to the back room to wake his sisters. The next morning, Caleb heard quiet talking from the back room before all 5 children came out, blinking in the daylight. They ate breakfast the same way they had eaten dinner, quiet and thankful. Caleb made sure they all had a second helping of cornmeal mush with a little molasses. May even gave a tiny smile when she tasted it, and seeing that made Caleb feel a warmth spread through his chest. "All right," he said after the plates were cleared. "We need to figure out how this is all going to work." The children all looked at him, and that tired, wary look returned to their eyes. This was the part they knew. This was when the rules were laid out. Caleb turned a chair around and sat on it backward, resting his arms on the back. "First off, this is a working ranch. I've got 3 horses and 60 acres that need tending. I cannot do it all by my lonesome, so I'm going to need some help. But you are children, not hired hands. So here's the deal." He looked at Nate, who was the oldest at 12. "I will need your help with the bigger chores, like fixing fences and chopping wood. I will not work you like a grown man, but I need you to work like you are part of keeping this place going. Is that fair?" Nate thought for a moment, then nodded. "Fair. Elsie, you said you know how to cook and mend clothes, is that right?" "Yes," she whispered. "My mother taught me. Then you are in charge of the kitchen." "Elsie, you'll be in charge of the kitchen and making sure our clothes stay in one piece. Now, I can cook a little, but your help would sure make things easier. I have been sewing my own buttons on for 3 years now, and while they mostly stay put, they are not a pretty sight." That managed to get a little hint of a smile from Elsie. That was progress. "Ben and Ruth, you two are old enough now to help with the lighter chores. Things like gathering eggs once we get some chickens, feeding the horses and keeping the wood box full. Just things that need doing but will not break your backs. May, you are still just a little thing, so your only job is to stay warm and safe. You let your sisters look after you when they need to." Does everyone understand their part? They all nodded, but Caleb could see the question forming on Nate's face before the boy even spoke. "What happens if we cannot do it? What if we are not good enough at the work?" And there it was. The fear that was hiding under everything else, the belief that their worth depended on their work and that failure meant being sent away. "Then we will figure it out together," Caleb said simply. "Look, I am not expecting you to be perfect. I am just expecting you to try. You do your best, you learn as you go, and you ask for help when you need it. That is all. This is not some deal where you have to work to earn your keep. This is a family learning how to work together. And in a family, everyone helps out with what they can. Some days that is a lot. Some days it is not so much. But it does not change the fact that you belong right here." Ruth's eyes started to fill with tears. Elsie bit her lip. Even Nate looked shaken, as if the whole idea of belonging without strings attached was too new to understand. "Now," Caleb continued, changing the subject before they all got overwhelmed with emotion, "we have to make this little cabin work for 6 people instead of just 1. That means we are making some changes. I am thinking we clear out the storage room and turn it into a real bedroom. The girls can keep the back room, and the boys will take the new one once it is ready. Until then, we will just make do with what we have got. Any questions?" "Where will you sleep?" Ben asked. "I will figure something out. I might just build a little room on come spring, or I might take the storage room after we move things around. Do not you worry about me. I have slept in places a whole lot worse than a floor next to a warm stove." They spent the entire morning moving things around. The storage room was packed with 3 years of stuff a single man collects. There was broken tack, empty crates, and tools that needed fixing. It was the mess of a man who had been too busy just trying to survive to get properly organized. Caleb and Nate hauled everything out into the main room while Elsie swept away years of dust from the corners. They found an old rope bed frame all in pieces and parts of another mattress that the mice had gotten into. They also found blankets that smelled like cedar and old memories. "This was my folks' extra stuff," Caleb explained, looking at the bed frame. "Pa built it when they first settled this place, before they could afford anything better. It is rough, but it is solid." He looked over at Nate. "You think we can put it back together?" They worked right alongside each other. Caleb showed Nate how to thread the rope to support the mattress and how to pull it tight so it would not sag. The boy had good hands and learned quickly. He did not need to be told things more than once. They worked in a comfortable quiet, the kind that does not need to be filled with chatter. By noon, they had a working bedroom. It was small, barely big enough for the rope bed and a crate for their things, but it was private. Elsie had scrubbed the floor clean, and Ruth had added a small drawing she had made with a piece of charcoal on scrap paper. It was a picture of a house with 5 stick figures standing in front of it. She had tacked it to the wall with a bent nail, and it turned the empty room into a place that belonged to someone. "It is perfect," Nate said in a quiet voice, and Caleb pretended not to see him wipe his eyes. They ate a simple lunch of fried potatoes and the last bit of bacon. Then Caleb made an announcement that immediately changed the feeling in the room. "I need to ride into town this afternoon. We need some supplies, more food, lamp oil, and a few other things. It is about a 3-hour round trip, so I will be back before it gets dark." The fear was instant and plain to see. May grabbed onto Ruth's hand. Ben shuffled closer to Nate. Even Elsie's face went white. "You are leaving?" Nate's voice was steady, but Caleb could hear the slight tremble underneath it. "Just for a few hours. We need food, and I need to—" He stopped when he realized what they were really hearing. Not that he was going for supplies, but that he was leaving them. That this was the moment when grown-ups go away and just do not come back. The moment when promises break and children get left behind all over again. "I am coming back," he said, his voice firm. "This is not me leaving you. This is me riding to town for supplies. And then I am riding right back home. Back to you, all of you." "Can we come?" Ruth asked, her voice just a whisper. Caleb thought for a second. 3 hours on horseback in the cold November air with 5 kids who had never ridden, all just to prove he was not abandoning them. It did not make any sense. It would take twice as long. It would be cold and hard, and completely unnecessary, logically speaking. "Get your coats," he said. The ride to Prospect Junction took almost 5 hours, with everyone doubled up on the horses. May rode in front of Caleb on his gelding Scout, all wrapped up in a blanket and chattering away about the— She pointed out everything she noticed. A hawk circling high above, a rabbit frozen in the grass, and the way the morning frost glittered. Ruth sat behind Elsie on the reliable old mare, Rosie. Nate and Ben rode together on the 3rd horse, a fussy creature named Birdie who seemed annoyed by the whole business. They must have looked like a strange procession coming down the main road. Just one rancher, 3 horses, and 5 children who looked like they were put together from scraps of misfortune. Caleb felt the town's eyes on them. He heard the quiet that fell as they passed the general store and the saloon. Let them all stare. He had to get supplies and had no time for their quiet judgments. He hitched the horses in front of Mercer's store. He told the children to stay near and not to answer any questions, but to send anyone who bothered them straight to him. They all gave a solemn nod and followed him in. Harold Mercer was a sharp man in his 50s who had been overcharging folks for years. His eyebrows shot up when he saw Caleb and the children. He said, "Caleb Harlow, I heard you caused quite a stir at the auction." Caleb ignored the remark and handed him a list. "I need flour, cornmeal, salt pork, and coffee. Also lamp oil, beans, and sugar, and whatever dried fruit you have that is not too expensive." Mercer's gaze slid over to the kids huddled by the entrance. "That is a whole lot of food for a single man." "I am not single anymore, it seems," Caleb said flatly. "Can you get these things, or do I need to ride on to the next town?" "Oh, I can get them," Mercer said, and started gathering the items. A balance. He said he was just making small talk. "Folks are just curious," he added, "and a man on his own taking in 5 orphans. It makes people ask things." "What kind of things?" "Just practical things. Wondering if you know how to raise children. The Child Welfare Society is supposed to check on these placements, you know, to make sure the children are not being used for labor." Caleb's hands tightened into fists at his sides. "Those children have a roof over their head and food in their bellies. Most important, they are together. That is what I am doing. If anyone has an issue with it, they can come to my ranch and say it to my face." Mercer put his hands up as if to surrender. "I am just telling you what I've heard, Caleb. No reason to get all riled up." But Caleb was riled up. He could feel the children's eyes on him. He knew they were listening to this man doubt him. He knew they were hearing that he was not a good fit for them, that this whole thing was wrong. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, his voice low. $32. It was pure robbery, and both men knew it. Caleb only had about $40 to his name. Mercer was taking advantage because he knew Caleb had no other choice right now. But Caleb would not argue. Arguing would just make the children stand there longer, listening to all this talk. He counted out the money and watched Mercer slowly bag the supplies. Once it was done, he loaded everything onto the horses, carefully balancing the weight. The whole thing took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Just as they were getting on their horses, someone called out from across the street. "Mr. Harlow, may I have a word?" Caleb turned and saw Mr. Fletcher walking toward them. He was carrying that same leather case and had the same worried look on his face. Caleb felt Nate get nervous behind him. "Mr. Fletcher," Caleb said, his voice cold as a winter morning, "I am glad I found you. I just wanted to see how the children are doing." Fletcher's smile did not reach his eyes. "It is just standard procedure. They are fine. I would feel better if I heard that from them," Fletcher said, stepping closer to the children. "How is everyone? Is Mr. Harlow treating you all right?" Nate spoke up before Caleb could stop him. "We are fine. He is keeping his word. He is keeping us together." Fletcher's smile seemed to get tighter. "That is good to hear, but I am required to make sure you are being cared for properly. That means I will have to visit from time to time." "Then visit," Caleb cut in. "Ride out to the ranch. You can see for yourself where they sleep and what they eat. You can see they are safe and together. But do not you dare question them here in the middle of town. I am only doing my job. Your job was to sell them off. Now they are my responsibility. That means you come through me. If you want to see them, you come to my ranch. If you want to ask them questions, you ask me first. You will not treat them like criminals in the street." Fletcher's calm expression finally broke, showing a flicker of anger. "Mr. Harlow, I know you think you are doing a good thing, but the fact is we do not usually place children, especially young girls, with single men." "There are worries about," Caleb cut him off, his voice low and full of danger. "Go ahead and say what you mean. Stop hiding behind your fancy words and tell me what you are accusing me of." The entire street had gone silent. Everyone was watching them now. Fletcher looked around, realizing he had an audience. "I am not accusing you of a thing. I am just saying the society has rules and I have to make sure those rules are being followed. I will be at your ranch within a week for a proper inspection. If things are as they should be, then great. If not," he let the threat linger. "You do that," Caleb said. "And when you are done, you should go inspect all those other homes. Make sure the children who were split up are doing as well as my children are together." He turned his back on Fletcher, helped May onto the horse, and then climbed up behind her. The others mounted their horses quickly, sensing it was time to leave. They rode out of town without looking back, leaving Fletcher standing there with his leather case and his veiled threats. After a mile of silence, Elsie's small voice asked, "Is he going to take us away from you?" Caleb wanted to promise them no, that Fletcher had no power over them, but he knew that empty promises were worse than the hard truth. "He is going to try to find a reason to," Caleb told them honestly. He will come to the ranch and look for anything, no matter how small, that he can use against me. Proper care, not some nonsense Fletcher made up. That man would surely twist everything in his report to get his way. Nate's voice was quiet, full of that old weariness. So what are we going to do? It was the sound of a boy who had learned some fights, just could not be won. We are not going to give him a reason, Caleb said, his voice firm. We are going to make this ranch a better home than any place in this territory. We will show him you have beds and food and someone who cares. We will prove that being together with family is better than being apart with strangers who only want your labor. And if he still tries to take you... Caleb paused. He felt May's small body trusting him, and he could feel the weight of 4 other children looking to him for a sliver of hope. If he still tries, then we fight. We will fight with everything we have. I meant what I said. Y'all are not being separated. Not as long as I am breathing. The quiet that followed was different. It was not soaked in fear. This silence had a backbone. What do we need to do? Nate asked again. But this time his voice was solid. It was filled with determination. We have to pass his inspection. We need to show that man we are a family that pulls its weight. Can you all do that? Yeah, Nate said. Behind him, 4 other voices made the same promise. Yeah, we can do that. They rode the rest of the way home as the sun dipped low, painting the November sky in shades of purple and orange. When the small, drafty cabin came into view, it looked different to Caleb. Yesterday, it was just a lonely place he was building from scratch. Today, it was a home for 6 people, and the cost of losing it had just shot sky high. He helped everyone down, unloaded their supplies, and showed Nate the right way to unsaddle and brush down a horse. The work felt good and steady. Elsie took charge of the supplies, putting the flour and cornmeal in the bins where Caleb showed her. Ruth and Ben hauled firewood inside, stacking it neatly by the stove. Little May sat at the table, making patterns with dried apples and humming a tune. They moved around one another like strangers trying to figure out how to be something more. They were not quite a family yet, but you could see the shape of one forming. Dinner was beans and cornbread again, but they had stewed apples with molasses for a treat. Caleb watched the children eat. He saw how Nate made sure everyone got a fair share. He saw how Elsie helped May cut her cornbread into little pieces. He saw Ben and Ruth leaning on each other without even thinking about it. These were habits learned from hardship, and Caleb wondered how long it would be before they felt safe enough to let go. After dinner, while the older kids were washing up, Ben came and stood by Caleb's elbow. He looked like he had been holding a question in all day. Do you know how to read? Caleb looked down at the boy's serious little face. Yes, I can read. Why do you ask? Could you teach us? Ma was showing me my letters before she passed, but I have forgotten some. Ruth never even got to start. He trailed off, looking a bit shy. Something tight in Caleb's chest let go. Yes, I can teach you. I have a few books. It is not much, but it is enough to get started. We will make it a routine. After supper, before bed, we will have lessons. Ben's face broke into the first real smile Caleb had ever seen from him. Really? For real? Go get your brother and sisters. Let us see where everyone is at. They gathered around, and Caleb brought out his small stack of books. There was a Bible, a book of Shakespeare his own mother had cherished, a farmer's almanac, and a book of frontier stories with pages worn soft as cotton. He started simply, having them each read a little so he could see what they knew. Nate read slowly but got the words right. Elsie read a bit smoother, getting more confident as she went. Ben knew his letters but had trouble putting them together. Ruth did not know any at all and just watched the others with big, hopeful eyes. All right, Caleb said, here is the plan. Nate and Elsie, y'all keep practicing with the harder books. I will work with Ben on sounding out words. And Ruth, you and I will start with the alphabet. Every night after supper we read. We will all get better together. Sound good? They all nodded. For the next hour, the cabin was filled with the sound of quiet reading and Caleb's gentle corrections. May fell asleep in Ruth's lap, and they just let her be. When the light got too low, Caleb said lessons were over. He watched them put the books away so carefully, as if they were afraid the chance might vanish by morning. Getting everyone settled for the night was easier this time. The girls went to their room without hesitating. Nate and Ben tried out their new rope bed and said it was comfortable. Caleb banked the fire and laid his bedroll on the floor, listening to the house grow quiet. He was nearly asleep when he heard Nate's voice from the other room. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" There was a long pause. "Thank you for today, for not leaving us and for standing up to Mr. Fletcher, for everything." Caleb just stared up at the dark ceiling. He could feel the weight of that boy's gratitude. "You do not have to thank me for keeping a promise, Nate. That is just what folks are supposed to do." "Yeah, well," Nate said after a moment. "We have not met too many of those folks lately, so thanks anyway." Caleb did not know what to say to that. He just laid there in the dark, listening to 5 children breathing. He thought about Fletcher's inspection and all the ways this new little family could be torn apart. But for tonight, they were together and safe. Tonight, a 12-year-old boy who expected the worst had said thank you, like maybe he was starting to believe things could be different. Tomorrow, they would get ready for the fight. But tonight, they had made it through one more day as something that looked an awful lot like a family. And that was going to have to be enough. The notice came 3 days later. It was nailed to the fence post where he was sure to see it. It was on official paper, in Fletcher's perfect handwriting. The words tried to sound proper, but they felt like a threat. A formal home inspection was set for Saturday, November 21st at 10 in the morning. Everyone had to be there. Failure to cooperate would mean the immediate removal of the children. Caleb stood in the cold air and read it twice before balling the paper up in his fist. Saturday. That gave them 4 days. 4 days to make a bachelor's rough-and-tumble cabin look like a place that could pass Fletcher's inspection. He walked back to the house. Nate was already up, feeding wood into the stove. The boy saw the look on Caleb's face and stood very still. "He is coming Saturday," Caleb told him straight. 10 in the morning. "We have got 4 days to get this place ready." Nate's jaw set, but he just nodded. "What do we need to do?" Over breakfast, Caleb laid out the plan for all of them. The cabin had to be spotless. Floors scrubbed, windows washed, everything put in its place. The children had to look well cared for, with clean clothes and full bellies. They had to prove this was a real home, that Caleb was a good guardian, and that this was the best place for them. "He is going to ask you questions," Caleb warned, looking at each of them. "He will probably try to talk to you alone to trip you up. He will ask if I treat you right, if I work you too hard, if you feel safe here. I want you to tell the truth, but do not give him more than he asks for. Keep your answers short and simple. Do not let him twist your words around." What if he asks why we want to stay?" Ruth's voice was just a whisper, but it was steady. Caleb looked at the children. "Then you tell him God's honest truth. You tell him that being a family is what matters most." He knew Fletcher would argue that proper homes were better than being together with him. "You have to make him see that splitting you up ain't living, it's just getting by." Elsie raised her hand. "What if he says you ain't a real guardian, that you're not married and there is no woman to look after us girls?" It was the very question Caleb feared. In the 1880s, a single man raising young girls was scandalous. Fletcher would surely use that against them. "We'll just point out that plenty of widowed fathers raise their daughters just fine," Caleb said, trying to sound sure of himself. "We will show him you are cared for, safe, and getting an education. We will make him understand that our kind of family is a whole lot better than no family at all." For the next 4 days, they worked to turn the cabin into a proper home. Elsie took charge of cleaning with a fury, scrubbing the floors until the wood grain showed. Ruth helped, her little hands getting into every corner. Caleb and Nate worked outside, fixing the sagging porch and clearing out the barn. They worked with a quiet focus, and Caleb was impressed by the boy. Nate never complained, just moved from one chore to the next. On Thursday, they sat on the porch steps for a rest. The November sun was pale and gave no real warmth. "Can I ask you something?" Nate said, not looking at Caleb. "Always. Why are you really doing this? And not just because of some promise. You could have just walked away." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. It was a fair question. "Do you know the worst part of losing my folks?" Caleb finally said. "It was the loneliness. This whole place was built for a family. After they passed, it was just me and all this quiet. That quiet just about ate me alive." He turned to Nate. "When I saw you 5, I saw what my life had become. Just going through the motions, surviving but not really living. I thought if I could stop that from happening to y'all, maybe this place wouldn't feel so empty." Nate's eyes looked a little shiny. "So, we are here 'cause you are lonely?" "No. You are here because you are a family that belongs together. The loneliness is just why I noticed y'all in the first place." Caleb smiled a little. "Splitting you up is just plain wrong, and I am too stubborn to let a wrong thing happen if I can help it. Even if it costs you everything? Son, I started with $60 and a ranch that was barely making it. Now I have you 5, and a real reason to fight. By my math, I am coming out way ahead." Nate let out a short, surprised laugh. "That is some terrible math." "Yeah, well, I was never much for numbers. Come on, we have more fence to fix." Have you ever felt like you were fighting a battle you were bound to lose? That's where Caleb was, trying to keep 5 orphans together when a man with a badge was determined to tear them apart. This is a story about how a little girl's fever became a test of what family truly means. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just show up and care. After practicing their lines for the inspector, Caleb sent the yawning children to bed. But he just laid there, staring at the dark, his mind racing. He worried that his $60 and all his good intentions would mean nothing against a man with a rule book. He must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing he knew, Elsie was shaking him awake in the pale morning light. "Caleb, get up," she whispered. "Something is wrong with May." He was up in a flash, following her to the back room. Little May was curled up, shaking hard in Ruth's arms, even under a pile of every blanket they had. Her face was bright red, and her breathing was quick and shallow. Caleb touched her forehead and felt a powerful fever. "How long has she been this way?" he asked, his voice steady while his heart hammered against his ribs. Ruth's voice trembled. "She was warm last night, but I woke up an hour ago and she was burning. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest doctor, a simple sickness could turn deadly fast. Elsie, get me some cool water and rags. Ruth, you stay right with her." He then called out to the other room, "Nate, I need you." The boy appeared, and his face went white when he saw May. Caleb put a firm hand on his shoulder. "She has a fever. I need you to ride to town and bring Doc Harrison back. Can you do that?" Nate's voice shook. "I have never ridden that far by myself, but I will do it." Caleb gave him directions, helped him saddle their steadiest horse, and watched him ride into the dawn, feeling both fear and pride. Then he went back inside to fight the fever that could ruin everything. He spent the morning trying to cool May down and get her to drink some willow bark tea. Ben stood in the doorway looking terrified, so Caleb gave him a job. "Mr. Fletcher is coming at 10 o'clock. I need you to watch for him and tell him the inspection has to wait." Ben nodded, glad to have a task, and stood guard on the porch. But May's fever only climbed higher. Her breathing grew shallow. Caleb knew this was more than a simple cold. It felt like the same sickness that had taken her parents. Just before 10, Ben shouted, "2 riders are coming." Caleb's heart sank, expecting Fletcher to use this crisis against him. He prepared for a fight. But when the riders got closer, he saw it was Nate, and beside him, a gruff-looking man in his 60s with a medical bag. It was Doc Harrison. "Where is Fletcher?" Caleb asked as Nate jumped off the horse. "Passed him on the road," Nate said. "He told me he would come back on Monday. and that this had better not be some trick. Caleb pushed down his anger and led the doctor inside to May. The doctor worked quickly, his face serious. "It is pneumonia," Dr. Harrison finally announced. "We caught it early, which is a good thing. She will need constant care for the next few days." He pulled a bottle from his bag. "This medicine 3 times a day. You have someone who can watch her around the clock?" Caleb answered without hesitation. "We will all take shifts. She will have whatever she needs." The doctor looked around the clean cabin at the worried children, and then his eyes settled on Caleb with a look of approval. "You are the man who took in all 5 of these children, aren't you?" It was not a question. "Yes, sir." Harrison nodded. "I also heard Fletcher plans to take them away. Says a single man is not fit to care for them." Caleb's hands tightened into fists. "We are doing just fine." The doctor looked at the care being given to the sick child. "I can see that. But what I see and what the law sees can be 2 different things. Fletcher has rules on his side." "What do you have?" "I have them," Caleb said simply, "and they have each other." The doctor studied him for a long moment. "I will be back tomorrow. My fee is $2 for the visit and 50 cents for the medicine." Caleb knew that $2.50 would hurt, but May's life was worth everything. As the doctor was leaving, he paused at the door. "You know, when Fletcher comes back on Monday, he's going to ask my opinion on all this." Caleb's throat went dry. "And what are you going to tell him?" "I am going to tell him the truth," Harrison said, his voice firm. "I am going to say I found a sick child being looked after by a family that loves her, that this home is clean, and these children are better off here together than they would ever be apart." He gave a small, grim smile. "I know good care when I see it, and this is not neglect." He left before Caleb could even say thank you. Nate closed the door, his eyes wide with hope. "He is going to help us." "Maybe," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "But May is still sick and Fletcher is still coming. Let's get back to work." They set up shifts, and through fevered dreams and long nights they all worked together, proving that family is not about rules, but about showing up for each other. By Sunday morning, May's fever was gone. She woke up weak, but her eyes were clear. When Caleb came inside, she looked right at him and whispered, "You stayed." "Well, of course I stayed," Caleb said, kneeling by her bed. "Where else would I go?" "Mama and Papa did not stay," she whispered back. "I thought you would leave too." Caleb felt his heart ache. He slowly took her small hand in his. "Listen to me, May. Your Mama and Papa did not want to leave. They fought hard, but sometimes the sickness wins. That is not leaving, that is being taken away. Do you see the difference?" She nodded, tears rolling down her face. "Well, I am not sick, and I am not going anywhere. We are all staying right here together. That is a promise." "All right," she whispered, and for the first time, she gave him a tiny, real smile. Doc Harrison came back that afternoon and said May was out of the woods. He would not take any money. "Just consider it my part in keeping this family together." After the doctor left, Caleb gathered everyone in the main room. "I want to say something before Mr. Fletcher gets here tomorrow," he began. "These last few days have been hard. We have all worked till we were bone-tired, and we have been scared to death over May. And tomorrow we have to convince a man that we are a real family." He looked at each of them. "But here is what I realized while we were taking care of May. We already are a real family. We take care of each other. We work together. We fight for each other. That is what a family does. So tomorrow, we are not going to put on a show for him. We are just going to show him the truth. We will show him that 5 children who lost everything found their way back to each other, and they found someone who will make sure they are never lost again. We will show him this family is real no matter what his paperwork says. Nate pushed his chair back, the sound sharp in the tense room. What if telling him the truth is not enough? What if he just takes us anyway? Caleb looked him square in the eye. Then we fight. We holler until someone higher up listens. We will get Doc Harrison to speak for us. We will make a racket they cannot ignore. He lowered his voice. Listen to me, Nate. Whatever happens tomorrow, I am not giving up on you or your siblings. Y'all are not being split up again. Not as long as I am drawing breath. The room was thick with fear, but a little hope was mixed in too. Ruth's voice, though small, was firm. We are not giving up either. Elsie added with a weary smile. We will be perfect for one more day, if we have to. Caleb nodded. That is right. He then turned to Nate. If that man takes you tomorrow, if the law says he can, I will come for you. I will find every single one of you and bring you home. That is not a promise, Nate. That is a fact. The boy's shoulders slumped in relief. Okay, knowing you would come helps. Caleb's voice was a low rumble. I will always come. Sleep did not come easy for Caleb that night. The wind howled outside, a lonesome sound that seemed to slip through the cracks in the cabin walls. He imagined Mr. Fletcher somewhere in town, polishing his arguments to prove this makeshift family did not deserve to exist. Staring into the darkness, Caleb made a vow. When Fletcher arrived, he would not just see a bachelor rancher with 5 orphans. He would see a family forged in fighting sickness, in late-night reading lessons, and in shared work. He would see 5 children who were worth every bit of trouble. And if Fletcher refused to see it, if he tried to tear them apart, Caleb would do just what he told Nate. He would fight until he had nothing left to fight with. Then he would find a way to fight some more, because that is what families do. Monday morning dawned cold and sharp. Caleb was up before the sun, his hands not quite steady as he started the coffee. Today was the day. In just a few hours, a man from the government would decide their whole future. The children got up on their own, moving with a strange quiet. Elsie had already laid out their cleanest clothes. She had mended shirts and let out the hems on dresses. They put them on carefully, as if the worn cotton was a suit of armor. May was still weak from her sickness, but her fever was gone. Ruth helped her into a faded blue dress, the little girl's face pale but her eyes sharp, watching everything. Breakfast was quiet, just oatmeal with the last of their molasses. Caleb wanted to say something to calm their fears, but the right words would not come. Finally, Nate broke the silence. What time is he coming? Caleb took a long drink of his coffee. 10 o'clock, same as last time. We have about 2 hours. He gave them their jobs. Elsie and Ruth would handle things inside. Nate would help him with a final check of the property. Ben was to stay with May and keep her warm by the stove. They all moved to their tasks without a word. It felt like they were preparing for a battle, setting up their defenses to protect their home. Caleb and Nate walked the ranch, making sure the new fence posts were obvious and the barn was tidy. They left nothing for Fletcher to criticize. The simple work was calming, and Caleb was glad to have Nate beside him. You scared? Nate finally asked, kicking at a frozen patch of dirt. Terrified, Caleb admitted honestly. Nate's voice cracked. I keep thinking about all the other times, all the promises that got broken. I know you are different, but what if meaning it is not enough? Caleb stopped and faced him. Then we will make it enough, son. We will not let him win. They walked back to the cabin, the silence heavy between them. Caleb just hoped he could live up to the words he just spoke. At 9:45, they saw a rider coming. But it was not Fletcher's buggy. It was a single horseman. And as he got closer, Caleb recognized Sheriff Dugan. He was a man in his 50s who ran the law in Prospect Junction with a tired patience. Caleb met him at the fence. Sheriff, did not figure on seeing you out here. Dugan swung down from his horse. Fletcher asked me to come along. Said he wanted an official witness. He looked at Caleb with a hint of sympathy. Looks like he is building a case against you. Caleb's gut tightened. A case for what? For not following the society's rules about placing children, Dugan said, tucking his gloves in his belt. Look, Caleb, I am just here to watch. But I should tell you, Fletcher has some powerful folks backing him on this, the Werrick family. The name sent a chill through Caleb. The big ranch east of town? That is the one, Dugan confirmed. Seems Mrs. Werrick took a shine to your boy Nate at the auction. When she heard you took all 5 kids, she complained to the board. Said it was wasteful for one man to have 5 when good families were looking for just 1. Fletcher is not just here to check on things, Dugan said, his face hard as a rock. He is looking for a legal excuse to tear this family apart for the Werricks. The world seemed to tilt under Caleb's feet. This was not a routine check. It was a calculated move to take Nate and break the promise Caleb had made to all 5 children. They cannot do that, Caleb said, but his own voice sounded weak. I signed the papers. Dugan shook his head. Papers that Fletcher wrote, full of fine print about relocating children. Did you read every last word? A stone settled in Caleb's stomach. He had been in such a hurry to get the children to safety that he had not. What can I do? Dugan looked toward the cabin where small faces peered from the window. Show him the truth. Show him what you are building here. Most folks in these situations are just looking for cheap labor. If what you have is different, you make sure he sees it. As he spoke, a fancy buggy came over the horizon, pulled by horses that cost more than Caleb's entire ranch. The man driving, Fletcher, held the reins with the easy confidence of someone who believed the law was on his side. Maybe it was. Maybe 8 days of reading lessons and nursing a sick child would mean nothing against official rules and wealthy families. But Caleb had given his word to Nate. He was not giving up. Fletcher climbed down from his buggy, dressed in a pressed suit and polished boots that looked absurd on the dusty ranch. His eyes scanned the property, judging everything. Mr. Harlow, Sheriff Dugan. His tone was professional, but Caleb could hear the satisfaction just beneath the surface. The man already believed he had won. Shall we proceed? Before we do, Caleb said, his voice firm. Let's be clear. You are here to confirm these children are being cared for properly, correct? Yes, among other considerations. Then let us focus on that, Caleb insisted. Not on pressure from other families. Just on whether these 5 children are better off now than they were last week. Fletcher's expression turned cold. I do not appreciate the suggestion that I am motivated by anything other than the children's best interests. Then prove it, Caleb said. Come inside and be honest in your assessment. After a long moment, Fletcher motioned toward the cabin. After you, Mr. Harlow. Inside, Fletcher immediately began taking notes in his portfolio. He checked the windowsills for dust and counted the supplies in the cupboards. Caleb could not tell if the man was thorough or just looking for flaws. The children stood together nervously, and Fletcher seemed annoyed by their presence, as if they complicated his plans. Where do the children sleep? Fletcher asked. Caleb showed him the girls' room and the small storage area for the boys. Fletcher measured the spaces and checked the bedding, making notes about the lack of locked doors and the closeness of the sleeping quarters. These arrangements are highly irregular, Fletcher announced, his pen scratching the page. In a proper placement, there would be clear boundaries. This is a frontier cabin, not a boarding house, Caleb replied. Safety and warmth matter more than privacy. These children have warm beds, and they are sleeping better than they ever did with you. You cannot possibly know that. Ask them. Fletcher turned to the children, who stood a little taller. Is that true? Are you sleeping well? Yes, sir, Nate said, and the others nodded. We are all together, Elsie added quietly. That makes everything better. Fletcher's jaw tightened as he made another note. He then questioned Elsie about their meals, but she answered with quiet confidence, showing him their organized food stores. Finally, Fletcher turned to May, who was wrapped in blankets by the stove. He knelt beside her. Hello, May. I heard you were very sick. How are you feeling now? Better, May whispered. Caleb took care of me. Fletcher glanced at Caleb. I understand a doctor was called. That must have been expensive. $2.50, Caleb said evenly. Money well spent to save a child's life. Can you afford such expenses again? Can you support 5 children through a hard winter? It was the question Caleb dreaded. The truth was he had maybe $10 left. On paper, he was nearly destitute. But numbers were not the whole story. This ranch is functional. I have skills. I can work. We have stored enough food to make it through the winter. It will be tight, yes, but we will manage. That is what families do. They figure it out together. Fletcher just made a long note in his book. You are focused on what might happen, Caleb said. The fact is, right now, these children are fed, sheltered, and cared for. Sheriff Dugan, who had been quiet, finally spoke. If I may, Fletcher, I have seen real poverty in this territory. I have seen children go hungry. This is not that. These children are healthy, and this cabin is a home. The roof did not leak, and the pantry was stocked. A person could argue numbers on a page all day long, but the truth of the matter was plain to see. Fletcher gave Sheriff Dugan a look that could curdle milk. He clearly did not welcome the sheriff's opinion. I understand your view, Sheriff, but our society has standards that go beyond just getting by. We have to think about long-term stability and a proper moral upbringing. What in the world does that mean? Caleb asked, already feeling a pit in his stomach. It means a single man raising 5 children, especially young girls, raises some flags. Without a wife in the house to offer guidance, without a traditional family, we have to ask if this is truly what is best for them. Fletcher snapped his folder shut. I will need to speak with each child alone. It is standard procedure. Caleb wanted to shout no, to gather the children behind him and shield them from this man's cold calculations. But he knew that would just give Fletcher the ammunition he was looking for. Fine, Caleb said, but Sheriff Dugan stays for every single one. And you will talk to them right here, where the others can see nobody is being dragged away. Fletcher looked ready to protest, but Dugan just nodded his head. Sounds fair to me. I will be here to watch. They began with Nate. The other children were sent outside, told to stay within hollering distance. The boy sat tall at the table, hands clasped tight, looking like a coiled spring. Caleb stood over by the stove, biting his tongue, trusting Nate to speak his own mind. Nate, I need you to be honest with me, Fletcher started. Are you happy living here? Yes, sir. Are you made to do work that is too hard for you? No, sir. Caleb shows me what needs doing and teaches me the right way to do it. It is not about hard labor. It is about us learning to run this ranch as a family. Does Mr. Harlow ever get angry? Does he ever strike you or the others? Never. Nate's voice was steady as a rock. He is a patient man. He explains things. He might get frustrated sometimes, but he never takes it out on any of us. And what about your sisters? Are they being looked after properly? They are getting better care than they ever got in one of your homes. Nate shot back, an edge creeping into his voice. Elsie is not treated like a hired hand. Ruth is learning her letters instead of just scrubbing floors. May gets to be a little girl, not a burden. We are safe here. Fletcher's pen stopped moving. Safe from what? From being split up, from being sent to folks who only want one of us, from having to choose between our family and a roof over our heads. Nate leaned across the table. You want to know if we are happy? We are more than happy. We are a family again. That is what Caleb gave back to us. Not just a house and food. He made us whole. The cabin grew quiet. Fletcher just stared at Nate, as if the boy had spoken in some strange tongue that was not in his rule book. A softness had come over Sheriff Dugan's face. When he caught Caleb's eye, the sheriff gave a slow, respectful nod. I see, Fletcher finally managed to say. Thank you, Nate. Please send Elsie in. The talks went on. Elsie, calm and clear, explained how she was learning to run a home, how Caleb gave her responsibility that felt like a gift, not a burden. Ben, though quiet, spoke earnestly about his reading lessons and how good it felt to sleep under the same roof as his sisters again. Ruth's answers were short but full of heart. She just kept saying, "We are together," like that was the only answer that mattered. They brought May in last. She climbed into the chair with Ruth standing right behind her like a little guard. Fletcher's tone softened. "May, do you like it here?" "Yes. Caleb is good to us. He brought the doctor when I was sick, and he reads us stories. And nobody ever says there are too many of us." She glanced at Ruth, then fixed her eyes on Fletcher. "Are you here to take us away again?" The question hung in the air, heavy as a stone. For a moment, Fletcher's professional calm faltered. You could see a flicker of shame, or maybe just the discomfort of a man about to do a terrible thing. "I am just trying to make sure you're in the very best place," he said, choosing his words with care. "We are," May said, with the simple, powerful truth only a 4-year-old has. "We are together. That is the best." Fletcher closed his folder and stood up. "Thank you, May. You can go outside with the others now." Once the children were gone, leaving only the 3 men, Fletcher put his official face back on. "I will be frank with you, Mr. Harlow. By all normal measures, what you have done here is fine. The children love you, the conditions are decent, and there is certainly no neglect. But I have concerns that are bigger than this little ranch." "Let me take a wild guess," Caleb said. "The Warwicks want Nate, and you are here to find a reason to hand him over." Fletcher did not even blink. "The Warwick family is well respected, with deep pockets. They can give Nate opportunities that a bachelor rancher scraping by never could. A formal education, connections, a secure future. Those things count for something. And what about his own family? Do they count for anything? Of course. That is why I am not suggesting we move all of them. The girls can stay here with you. Ben, too. But Nate is at an age where he needs a man with more resources, more stability, more money," Caleb cut in. "Just say it plain, Fletcher. You believe rich people are entitled to a poor man's children because they can buy them nicer things. I believe it is our duty to put a child in the best position to succeed. The Warwicks can give Nate things you cannot. Except the one thing he actually wants, which is to stay right here with his family." Caleb's voice was rising, and he fought to keep it steady. "You heard him yourself. He is not some stray puppy looking for the wealthiest owner. He is a boy who lost everything, and the only thing holding him together is his brother and sisters. You tear him away from them now, you will be ripping the heart right out of his chest." Fletcher did not back down. Sometimes hard choices have to be made for a child's own good, even if the child cannot see it. Nate is 12 years old. He does not know what is day to see what a raw deal he's getting when he could have a better life. "He sees it just fine," Dugan said, his voice low. Both men looked at the sheriff, who had been quiet for a spell. "I have been listening to you talk about resources and chances, Fletcher, and I've been watching those kids out that window. You know what I see?" He pointed toward the glass. The 5 children were huddled near the fence, holding hands just like they did on that auction platform. I see 5 little ones who have learned that grown-ups lie, promises get broken, and families are split up just to be practical. I see them holding on to each other, scared they will just vanish if they let go. You really reckon taking Nate to the Warwicks will help him? Or will it just teach him that the folks he loves can be bought and sold by people with money? Fletcher's jaw was tight. "With all due respect, Sheriff, placing children is not your business." "Maybe not. But I know right from wrong, and they are not always the same thing. By the letter of the law, you can probably move that boy. But in your heart, you would be doing the same wrong that was done to them the first time. I am just here to watch, like you asked, and I am watching a home that is working. I see kids who are doing well, and a man keeping a hard promise. You go ahead and put that in your report." Fletcher's face turned beet red. "My report will be based on professional rules, not feelings." He turned to Caleb. "You will get a formal notice within the week. For now, this placement stands, but I am recommending to the board that Nate Carver be moved to the Warwick home for his own good. The final decision will be made." Caleb's voice was hollow. In about a month. These things move slow. So you are telling me I have about a month to prepare a 12-year-old boy to have his family torn from him again. Is that it? Fletcher tucked his portfolio under his arm. I am telling you that we act in the best interest of the child, even if it goes against short-term feelings. Good day, Mr. Harlow. Sheriff. He left without another word. Caleb and Dugan stood in the cabin, which suddenly felt way too quiet. Caleb saw Fletcher walk up to the children. He saw Nate's face turn white as the man said something to him. Then Fletcher got in his buggy and rode off. And all 5 children turned to stare at the cabin with the same look of pure terror on their faces. What do I tell them? Caleb asked, his own voice sounding broken and strange to him. How do I say I failed them? You did not fail, Dugan said, his voice firm. You gave them 8 days of being a family. Now you have about a month to keep it that way. Do not waste time on feeling sorry for yourself. Use it to fight. How? Fletcher has the law on his side. The Warricks have money, and all I have is this ranch and good intentions. What in the world can I do? Dugan thought for a second. You ever hear that story about the rancher who took on the railroad? Everyone said he was a fool, that he could not fight a big company with plain old grit. But he fought them anyway. He made so much noise that folks started listening. In the end, the railroad gave up because the people were on his side. I am not fighting a railroad. I'm fighting a bunch of government rules. You're fighting for family, and that is something everyone understands. You have to tell your story. Get folks to see what is happening out here. You might make the board think twice. They can ignore one rancher, but they cannot ignore a whole territory of angry people. Caleb looked out at his 5 kids who were slowly walking back to the cabin. Something inside him turned hard as iron. Dugan was right. He had made a promise to fight for them, and that meant using any tool he had, even if it meant their family business would be spread all over the territory. You know anybody at the Territorial Times? Caleb asked. Dugan gave a grim smile. I know a reporter who just loves to call out folks in power who go too far. Give me a day. I will set it up. Thank you. Caleb put out his hand and Dugan shook it. Do not thank me yet. You are about to make some powerful people real unhappy. You be ready for that. I made a promise 8 days ago, Caleb said. I am ready for whatever comes. Dugan nodded, grabbed his hat, and went to his horse. Caleb watched him go, then turned to face the children coming inside. Fear and questions were all over their faces. Nate was the first to speak. He said he is going to have me placed with the Warricks. Is it true? There was no use in lying. Yes. The cabin just exploded. Ruth started crying. May grabbed Nate's leg, trying to hold him there. Ben just stood there, completely stunned. Elsie turned pale but said nothing, her hands shaking as she reached for her brother and sisters. Only Nate stayed calm, but Caleb saw the storm of anger and hurt in his eyes. When? Sometime this month. But Nate, Caleb walked over and knelt down to their level. Listen to me, all of you. This is not over. Fletcher just made a suggestion. The board makes the final call. And before they do, we are going to make sure they hear why you all belong together. We are going to fight this thing with all we have got. How? Nate's voice cracked. They have all the power and money. What do we have? We have the truth, Caleb said. We have Dr. Harrison to talk about how you have been cared for. We have Sheriff Dugan, who saw what happened today. We have 8 days that prove this family works, and we will tell that story to anyone who will listen. And if they take me anyway, Caleb looked right into Nate's eyes, then I am coming to get you. I do not care if it is legal or not. I will come get you and bring you back home. That is not a threat, it is a promise, because you are my family now, all 5 of you, and I do not let anyone steal my family. For a long moment, nobody said a word. Then Nate gave one sharp nod and pulled his brother and sisters into a hug. They stood there in the cabin, 5 kids holding on for dear life. Caleb watched them, his heart feeling like it was breaking and turning to steel all at once. This was not the neat and tidy solution Fletcher wanted. This was a family that refused to be broken, a promise being kept against all odds. And Caleb Harlow, a rancher who came to town 8 days ago for a horse and left with 5 children, stood in his home and got ready for the biggest fight of his life. Because some things were worth fighting for. Some promises had to be kept. And some families, no matter how new, were worth defending from anyone who tried to tear them apart. Especially then. The reporter from the Territorial Times showed up 2 days later. She was a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Mills. She rode up alone and shook his hand with a grip that could bring a bull to its knees. She looked to be about 40, dressed for a long ride, not a tea party. She carried a beat-up notebook and had a pencil tucked behind her ear. "Sheriff Dugan said you have a story for me about the Child Welfare Office," she said, getting right to the point. "I am listening." Caleb laid it all out for her. The auction, the $60, Fletcher's pressure, and the Warwicks' scheming. Catherine wrote it all down in a kind of chicken scratch, only stopping to ask questions that went straight to the bone. When he was done, she looked up from her notebook. He could see, "You understand what you're kicking over, don't you? Go public and you ain't just fighting Fletcher. You're taking on the whole Territorial Child Welfare Society. You'll be questioning everything they do and making some powerful enemies." Caleb stood his ground. "I've got enemies. What I need is friends." Catherine gave a sharp smile. "Then you came to the right place. Give me 3 days. When this story runs, it'll be on the front page and folks will listen." She was true to her word, talking to Doc Harrison, Sheriff Dugan, and even old Harold Mercer at the store. On the 3rd day, she left with a simple warning. Monday. Be ready. That weekend was heavy with worry. Caleb kept things normal with chores and lessons, but Nate grew quiet, already steeling himself for the worst. Sunday night, Caleb found him on the porch. "Can't sleep?" Nate hugged his knees tighter. "I keep wondering what to do when they come. If I should fight or just let 'em take me. Mama and Papa fought that fever something fierce, but it got 'em all the same. Sometimes fighting just makes it hurt more when you lose." Caleb thought for a moment. "The fever, son, that's just a thing that happens. It don't listen to reason. But this is about people. And people can be made to see the right of it. We fight because family don't give up on each other, no matter the odds." In the moonlight, Nate looked far older than his 12 years. "Why do you care so much? It'd be easier to just let me go. You could keep the others." "Easier ain't the same as right," Caleb said, looking the boy square in the eye. "I made a promise to all of you, together. That promise stands." Monday morning, the newspaper hit town like a thunderclap. The headline was plain as day. "Welfare Society tears family apart for rich donors." By noon, folks weren't just talking, they were angry. A rancher Caleb hardly knew rode up with a side of smoked bacon. "Read the paper," he grumbled. "What they're doing ain't right." Soon, another neighbor brought jars of preserves, and a woman from town came with fabric for the girls. Before long, a line of wagons stretched down the path, folks he'd never even met bringing supplies and offering a hand. The children watched from the porch, amazed. "Why are they all helping?" Ruth whispered. Caleb looked out at the line of neighbors. "Because folks round here know right from wrong, and your story reminded them what family is all about." Sure enough, not everyone was happy. A fancy carriage, pulled by 4 expensive horses, rolled up a few days later. A stern-looking man in his 50s and a woman dripping with disdain climbed out. It was Jonathan and Margaret Warwick. "We must speak with you," the man announced like he was king of the world. "If you mean about you trying to buy a boy, then I'm listening," Caleb said, blocking the path to the cabin. Warwick's face got ugly. "We are offering that boy a future you could never dream of. How dare you stand in his way?" "I'm keeping a family together," Caleb shot back. "You're the one trying to get free farm labor and call it charity." The woman tried a sweeter approach. "We would raise Nathan as our own son. Surely that is better than This. She waved a hand at the simple cabin. Caleb didn't budge. What I see are two people who think a child is something you can just buy. Nate's not for sale, and his family ain't spare parts you can throw away. Warwick's face turned red. You are condemning them all to poverty. How is that better than what we offer? Because we're together. Nate's voice cut through the air. He stood on the porch, his 4 siblings right beside him. You can offer me a fine education and a big house, but you can't offer me my brothers and sisters. Without them, nothing else matters. Margaret Warwick tried to soften her tone. Dear boy, you're too young to understand. No, ma'am, Nate said, stepping forward. I understand that I'd be giving up the only people who matter for folks who just want to use me. The best thing you can do for us is leave us be. Warwick looked about to explode. You ungrateful child! We're offering you everything. I'm choosing family over everything, Nate said, his voice steady as a rock. Caleb taught me that. Some things are worth more than money, and family is number one. Just glared. Jonathan then locked eyes with Caleb, his face a mask of cold anger. This is not finished. We have friends on the territorial board, the kind of friends you could never make. That newspaper story might have stirred up the local gossips, but government does not run on feelings. We will get the boy, and when we do, you will only have yourself to thank for making it so difficult. They got into their fancy carriage and left, leaving behind a cloud of dust and expensive perfume. Do you think they can still do it? Elsie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Can they take Nate away, even with the whole town on our side? I do not know, Caleb said honestly, but I reckon we're about to find out. The hearing was set for the next Friday at the courthouse in Cheyenne, a 60-mile ride away. Catherine Mills's article had caused such a stir that the board had no choice but to hold a proper review. Caleb got a formal notice saying he had to be there along with Fletcher. The board would hear from everyone involved before deciding Nate's fate for good. The morning they set out for Cheyenne, it seemed like the whole town came to see them go. Sheriff Dugan had found a wagon big enough for all 6 of them. Doc Harrison insisted on driving it himself. Someone has got to make sure you get there, he said, instead of wandering off to Mexico. Catherine Mills rode her horse alongside, her notebook out, ready to write down every last word. The trip took 2 full days. They spent the night on the trail, and a place where the owner had read Catherine's article about them. He refused to take their money and gave them the best room he had. For the family that is fighting back, the man said. Caleb felt the pressure of it all. They were not just fighting for themselves anymore. They had become a symbol for others. The courthouse in Cheyenne was a big, intimidating brick building. The hearing room was smaller than Caleb thought it would be, but it was completely full. Fletcher was there, looking far too confident. The Warwicks were also there, dressed in their Sunday best. Behind a long table sat the territorial officials, and about 40 townspeople filled the rest of the seats. Catherine's articles had made their fight the biggest story in the whole territory. The board was made up of 3 men. The chairman, Mr. Porter, was known to be a fair man. Mr. Clemens owned the 2nd biggest ranch in the area and was a friend of the Warwicks. The 3rd man was Reverend Michaels, a traveling preacher whose opinion on what was right and proper carried a lot of weight. Chairman Porter started the meeting. We are here to decide on the placement of Nathan Carver, who is 12 years old. He is currently in the temporary care of Mr. Caleb Harlow. The Territorial Child Welfare Society has recommended he be moved to the Warwick home. Mr. Harlow is fighting that recommendation. We will listen to everyone and then decide what is best for the boy. Fletcher went first. He laid out his case like a professional. He talked about Caleb being a single man, the money troubles, and the strange situation of a single man raising 5 children, especially young girls. He talked about the better resources the Warwicks could offer. He made it all sound so reasonable, like he was doing a kind thing by separating Nate, an act of mercy instead of cruelty. Then Jonathan Warwick himself spoke. He painted a grand picture of all the opportunities waiting for Nate at their ranch. He talked about private tutors, a big inheritance, and moving up in the world. He made it sound like they were offering the boy salvation, carefully not mentioning their real reason or the fact that they had specifically asked for a boy of working age. When it was Caleb's turn, he stood before the board, holding his hat in his hands, and just spoke the plain truth. I am not going to stand here and pretend I can offer Nate what the Warricks can when it comes to money or schooling. I cannot. But what I can offer is something they never once talked about: siblings. Brothers and sisters who have already lost their parents and cannot stand to lose each other too. These 5 kids, they are a family, and breaking them apart for convenience or money is just plain wrong no matter how you try to dress it up. He told them all about the auction, about finding the children standing up on that platform, and about the promise he made and had kept through sickness, inspections, and his own doubts. He told them about the reading lessons by the light of the lamp, the meals they shared, and the way these 5 kids had learned to be a family again in just a few short weeks. You want to know if I am the best guardian for these children? Well, maybe not by your standards, but I am the one who is keeping them together. I am the one fighting for them to stay whole. And sometimes that matters a whole lot more than money or status or what folks think is proper. Sometimes that is all that matters. A whole town showed up to do what was right. Doc Harrison spoke about the children's health. Sheriff Dugan confirmed things were in order. Catherine Mills even talked about how her articles had stirred up local support. Then, one by one, folks from town stood up. The station owner who gave them a place to stay. Neighbors who had dropped off food and clothes. Even old Harold Mercer had to admit that Caleb was buying plenty of food and paying his bills. But the whole room went quiet when young Nate was called to speak. There he stood, a 12-year-old boy, in front of 3 powerful men who would decide his whole life. He spoke with a sureness that was well beyond his years. He said, I know what the Warricks are offering me. It sounds real good, with the education and the money. If I was all alone in this world, I might take it. But I am not alone. I have my sister Elsie, who taught me how to read after our mama passed. I have Ben, who can make me laugh when things are bad. And I have Ruth and May. They need their big brother. When we lost our parents, we lost each other for a while. For 6 months, I was sick with worry, not knowing if my sisters were okay. It was worse than lonesome. It felt like our family was torn apart and thrown to the wind. Then Caleb came and put us all back together. He gave us a home. Nate then turned to the Warricks, with no anger in his eyes, just a deep sadness. Y'all seem like good folks. You would probably give me a fine life, but you would be giving it to just me, not to us. And I am not whole without my family. Taking me away would break all 6 of us. No amount of money in the world can fix that. He looked back at the board. So I am asking you, please do not separate us again. We have been through too much to lose each other now. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Margaret Warrick was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Several people in the crowd were wiping away tears. Chairman Porter's face had softened, and even the man on the Warrick's side seemed to be thinking twice. Reverend Michaels leaned forward and asked, Son, what if someone said you were giving up a better future by staying? Nate answered right away. I would tell them they have the wrong idea about what makes a life good. It is not about money. It is about having the people you love right there with you. My future with my family is the only future I want. The board members leaned in, their voices just a low hum as they talked. The room waited. Caleb reached out and took Nate's hand, and the boy held on tight. The other children held hands, waiting for the final word. At last, Chairman Porter spoke. This board has heard strong arguments from both sides. The opportunities offered by the Warrick family are considerable. However, we cannot ignore the powerful bonds of this family or the clear wishes of these children. The chairman's voice cut through the silent room, and Caleb's heart was beating like a drum. He announced that young Nathan Carver and his siblings, Elsie, Benjamin, Ruth, and May, would remain in the care of Caleb Harlow. The decision was permanent. A man from the Welfare Society, Mr. Fletcher, had his request to move the children denied flat out. Well, the room just about exploded with cheers. Nate collapsed against Caleb, letting out a sob of pure relief. The other kids rushed in, and Caleb was suddenly in the middle of a big, tearful, joyful hug. Fletcher looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Across the room, Margaret Ware stood up and walked over. She told Caleb they had made a bad mistake, blinded by wanting a child instead of doing what was right. She hoped they could all find it in their hearts to forgive her. As the room emptied, Chairman Porter came over. He told Caleb that 5 children was a monumental task. Caleb just cut him off and said, "It will not be too much. We will figure it out together." The 3-day journey back to the ranch was a pure celebration. Doc Harrison even brought out some apple cider for a toast to family and to promises kept. The children were all smiles, always touching each other just to be sure everyone was really there to stay. When they pulled up to the ranch, it felt different to Caleb. It was more than just a piece of land. It was a home they had fought for. And sitting right there on the porch were packages and crates. Neighbors had dropped off food, supplies, and even lumber with a note that said, "Welcome home." That night, long after the children were asleep, Caleb sat on that porch under the stars. The door creaked open, and Nate came out wrapped in a blanket. He said he just wanted to make sure it was all real. He thanked Caleb for everything, for keeping his promise when it would have been so much easier to just walk away. "I told you," Caleb said. "I do not break my promises." Nate said that not many men would have spent all their money and risked so much for children that were not even their own. Caleb looked at the boy who felt like a son. "That is where you are wrong, Nate. You are mine. All 5 of you. Maybe not by blood, but you are my family now. And family is always worth the fight." Nate leaned his head on Caleb's shoulder, and Caleb put an arm around him. They sat there in the cold looking at the stars, feeling like all the pieces of their lives were finally fitting together. Inside, 4 other children slept soundly, knowing they were safe and their family was whole. Life on the ranch would still be a struggle, and winter was coming on hard. But they would face it all together. They had become a family, not because it was easy, but because it was the right thing to do. And sometimes doing what is right is the only thing that truly matters. Years later, folks would ask Caleb about the best decision he ever made. He would tell them about going to town for a horse and coming home with 5 children instead. He would tell them how Nate grew up to run the ranch right alongside him. He would tell them how Elsie became a teacher for orphaned children, and Ben became a lawyer who fought for families. Ruth opened a station that always had a place for folks in need, and little May grew up to write wonderful stories. People said a single man could never raise 5 orphans on his own, that the smart thing to do was walk away. Caleb would just smile and say he was never all that smart. He was just stubborn enough to believe a promise was worth keeping. That stubbornness ended up saving 6 people. It saved 5 children who had lost everything, and it saved one lonely man who finally found a reason not to be alone. It was not a simple life, but it was their life. It was whole. They were a family, and that was everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.